Good afternoon. Welcome to the sixth and last session of This is Film Heritage in Practice, edition 2021. My name is Giovanna Fossati. I'm the chief curator of Eye Film Museum and professor of film heritage and digital film culture at the University of Amsterdam. This is Film is a collaboration between Eye Film Museum, the University of Amsterdam, and the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. The master students of the This is Film class help introducing and interviewing our guests each session. Welcome to all the This is Film students following the course this year. This is Film is also available online. The lectures and Q&A can be found on the Eye website for free. The films screened during the sessions are available on the Eye Film Player for a small fee. This year, we are focusing on the theme recycling, reuse, and remixing. Together with our guest speakers, we explore and discuss ethical, legal, political, and aesthetic questions related to the reuse of archival film. As usual, each session of This is Film includes an introduction, a Q&A, and a screening. Why are we talking about VR in a series on film heritage? The short answer is that VR is part of the moving image tradition and it belongs in the film archive. The longer answer is that film heritage is much more than collecting, restoring, and showing films from the past. In the broader sense of film heritage, VR belongs in a series on film archives, both as yet another creative and technological expression of cinema, as well as a suitable means for reenacting or performing films and many more aspects of cinema from the past. Indeed, film archival practice entails collecting films as well as the technological apparatus that has made possible to make and project them, the knowledge about how this apparatus has been used, and the knowledge about the experience of cinema, which includes theaters, screens, projection booths, technological standards, alternative practices, neighboring media technology, and much more. In fact, cinema has never been one thing. As stated by film historian Tom Gunning, while questioning the death of cinema caused by the digital, I quote, "Cinema has always been a point of intersection, a braiding together of diverse strands. Aspects of the telephone and the phonograph circulated around the cinema for almost 3 decades before being absorbed by sound cinema around 1928, while simultaneously spawning a new sister medium, radio. A variety of approaches to color, ranging from tinting to stencil coloring, existed in cinema, either common or minority practices, until color photography became pervasive in the 1970s. The film frame has changed its proportions since 1950, and it's now available in small, medium, and supersized rectangles. Television, CinemaScope, IMAX, for example. Cinema's symbiotic relation to television, video, and other digital practices has been ongoing for nearly half a century, without any of these interactions and transformations, in spite of numerous predictions, yet spelling the end of the movies." End of quote. In this vein, we can consider transition as inherent to film. Accordingly, film archival practices, from acquisition to exhibition, need to take film and cinema's transitional nature into consideration and look at their objects in a much broader framing than only film titles made through the years by a number of makers. Some of these ideas have been conveyed in recent years by scholars who have focused on media archaeology, and more recently on experimental media archaeology. Scholars such as Erkki Utamo, Jussi Parikka, Wanda Strauven, Benoit Turquety, Andreas Vickers, Annie van der Oever, Alexandra Schneider, and Tom Elsasser, among others. They all have led the way to new innovative research that bridges theory and archival practice and moves away from traditional film-centered approaches. For film archives, VR is not only one more technology to be collected, but another component of this broad panorama that can also help us look back at the past of film in new ways. VR installations can, for instance, create the virtual reenactment of obsolete film formats, including the historical film theaters or other settings they were shown in. This prerogative of VR makes those installations particularly suitable for performing film in its broader sense. That is not only cinema's artifacts, technologies, and practices, but also the experiences of all these elements together. As a medium in transition, film is constantly being adapted to the wants, needs, and practices of the time. Films originally made in one format have often had subsequent releases in different formats. Film prints are shown through different projectors with different light systems, and soundtracks are played through different sound systems. Thus, if we consider the performance history of a film as inherent to its lifeline, without solely focusing on one specific performance, for instance, its first public screening, thinking films as performances seems to be an important framework for preserving, showing, and accessing film heritage. In 2019, Argentinian creator Diego Compel showed the VR installation The Inhabited House at IDFA Doc Labs. Here, Compel reuses home movies in a novel and effective manner by performing their original settings, technologies, and the intimate atmosphere these films were made and experienced in. Not many VR projects explicitly engage with the performance of historical film technologies, formats, and practices. But the project we are addressing today did, in a very conscious and explicit way. A Machine for Viewing is a unique hybrid of real-time VR experience, live performance, film essay, and documentary that explores how we now watch films by putting cinema and VR, an old machine for viewing and a new one, face to face. In this perspective, we think it perfectly fits the This is Film series. I would like to introduce now Sarah Campion, Michelle Rensen, Dorce Nipius, and Justine Knein, the 4 This is Film students who will take over now. On behalf of the group, Dorce will introduce our guests.
Thank you, Giovanna. And I would like to introduce our 3 guests of today, starting with Richard Misek. He is a found footage filmmaker and he teaches at the University of Ghent. He calls himself an online friendly filmmaker, and his research and creative work explore the spaces between nonfiction film, visual art, and online video. Richard is the director of the documentary Roma in Paris and the author of the book Chromatic Cinema. Our second guest is Oscar Raby. He is the co-founder and creative director of VRTOV, a studio behind numerous VR films such as the really impressive VR experience of The Turning Forest and the autobiographical virtual reality documentary Ascent. He is a multimedia artist focused on portraiture and narrative using immersive media, and today we would love to ask him some questions about this. Last, but of course not least, I would like to introduce Charlie Shackleton. He's a writer, a non-fiction filmmaker, and a film critic. He's best known for his essay films Beyond Clueless and Fear itself, and for his 10-hour-long protest film, Paint Drying. In recent years, he made several short films, including an essay of criticism in the age of TikTok, and of short films like Personal Truth and Fish Story. I would like to thank our guests for being here, and today we would like to ask some questions about VR in general, and of course about the film that connects our guests together, A Machine for Viewing. And now I would like to give the floor to our guests.
It's so far back in time, I can barely remember now how the project started. I think it emerged from a small project I did, which gathered together some video essayists and artists and scholars at the Whitechapel Gallery in 2016 to talk about the theme of indefinite vision and to make some video essays about it. And about, I think, 7 or 8 video essays emerged from that. And what happened then? Oh yes, then I applied for some, then I just opportunistically applied for some funding to do something VR related because it was 2017 and that was the thing to be doing at that moment. And my sort of vague idea was simply how to perhaps we could try to turn some video essays into VR experiences. And so I asked Charlie, who had made one of the video essays for this event, and contacted Oscar as a kind of known VR creator, put the proposal in and then got the funding. And then we sort of tried to figure out what we were doing from there. And I think Oscar and Charlie can pick up where I leave off at that moment.
Yeah, well, so I remember you first kind of raising the idea of the project to me, Richard, and the brief at that point really being as open as what would video essay look like in VR. And I was coming from a place of real ignorance, having not worked with the technology before and really only very scantily experienced it, but was drawn to the question really for no reason more than just the fact that it felt kind of instinctively, it felt quite almost kind of iconoclastic to pursue that, because already, like, one of the things I like about video essay as a form is that it kind of takes these images of cinema that are often thought of or presented as quite kind of untouchable and totemic, and turns them on their heads and kind of uses them to various ends, and often kind of subverts their original intention, or at least their original context. And to do so in the new space of VR, which it felt like at that time especially was so fraught with debate from kind of cinema world people about, whether it even belonged in the same category as film, or, whether this was some sort of terrible interloper on the world of visual media, just felt very provocative and sort of an interesting space to take video essay into. And so from there, I very quickly and kind of overwhelmingly was introduced to an absolute mountain of stuff going on in the world of VR, which was all new to me, and is maybe a good place for Oscar to come in as the person for whom it was not new at all.
I think we were all new in one way or another to the to the storm, the creative storm, the technical storm, also the historical storm that we were unknowingly, unpreparedly getting ourselves into. When Richard mentions that in 2017, getting into VR, moving into VR was the thing to do. I think the signs, the dollar signs, to put it in a blunt way, were clear in terms of, if you want to get your project made, do something with VR. And I established a whole company around that and a whole practice around that. But to think of it as only and merely opportunistic in terms of getting the dollars would be to detract or distract ourselves from the historical point of VR meant something technically and creatively at that point. So when I received the call from Richard, when we started talking about this project, it was incredible for us here in my studio in Australia to start thinking about collaborating with partners in the UK in terms of having somehow align and find that synchronicity in terms of what happens. And this was the key question. If we think of film inside VR, but with the lens of essays, right, which has its own rules, its own ways of doing. And I was very, just like Charlie said, there's a big mountain of information in terms of what it means to engage with the creation and the production of VR. From my side was the same. Understanding what a film essay is, how do you recognize it, how do you create it, how do you write it, how do you present it, the length, the pace, the voice, the authorial voice that gets implemented and exercised. All of those things were quite big challenges, but the conversation was always easy to have, I would say. I think we all got along quite well in terms of how keen we were to engage with the conversation. And I would also like to point out that for our studio, for the work that we've been doing, there is this historical symbolism in terms of what VR is for the moving image, for narrative in the moving image practice. So my studio is called Verto, and if anyone will get that nod, would be this crowd. Verto is a nod to Ziga Verto, in the light of thinking what happened when Verto and his partners were taking this new toy, this new machine, out in the streets of St. Petersburg, and seeing what that machine did, what sort of world it captured, what sort of reality was recreating, reconstructing, and also making. I think when we do these things in VR today, especially within the convention of filmmaking, I tend to feel that the ghost of that practice wants to appear again. So for me, it's a revisiting that historical opportunity of seeing what the language does with these new toys and these new machines.
Maybe I would just like to briefly, partially retract my initial answer, as it was said hurriedly as I was put on the spot. I mean, of course, it was opportunistic in the sense that it was opportunistic. My initial response was opportunistically looking at the latest invader in the pantheon of film. And I think whenever film is echoing what Giovanna was saying in her introduction, whenever film is invaded from outside, it's an interesting place. I think that's probably what took me to found footage work initially. That's what attracted me to VR. It's what attracts me now, additionally, to live streaming and live Zoom performance, which is where my research is exploring right now. It's anything that sort of problematizes the standard kind of carrier format of film.
But I think you are right to mention the opportunism of what funding is available for at any one time, because of course that is crucial. Unless you're in some kind of privileged position where funding is irrelevant, then you know, creative ambition has to be kind of married with this pragmatic reality of where the money is at any one moment. And as you say, in 2017, it was very much there. And it's
VR
funny.
was the Bitcoin of 2017.
Yes, exactly.
VR was the NFT of 2017.
But it's funny because I remember hearing you say a similar thing once before in an interview about this project. And it's refreshing, but often quite like shocking to hear, because people just exclude that from the narrative of any project. And and even hearing you say it, like the kind of rational part of me is like, yes, that is true. That is partly how this came about. But then there's this part that's like, no, you tell like the polished kind of pure version where everything is entirely 100% artistically driven and motivated. But I think if this project, if no other, like the two are completely inseparable, because it's all about, you know, this transfer or this baton handing between one medium and another, not as in like one ceases to exist, but like the dialogue that inevitably arises between them, that is entirely born of like this parallel discussion about where is money gonna appear. And obviously in 2017, people weren't really sure where the money would come from with VR. It seems like they're no more sure now.
Nope.
But they've given up looking for it, maybe.
Yeah, Nick, glossing over the technical layer of a project like this, would be naive. And I think it's good that we can reflect back on time or about that time, because when we feel uncomfortable talking about funding and the money to make these things happen, is because it makes the art feel dirty, but it shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the case, because there's no technical, there is no appearance of the art. In this case, there is no film, there is no headset, if we don't have a technical layer that supports it, that is married to the language, right? The language exploration.
But I think that aspect has only become more kind of potent in the last year and a half as well, when, I mean, aesthetically and functionally, you know, the project is very much of a kind, with all of, you know, with the scores of like cinema environment VR apps that were already commercially available. And I think what's interesting to me about those is how much they obviously engage with the kind of physical and sensory reality of cinema going, but also seem to suggest this resistance to the transition from that to VR, that obviously now, you know, in the last year when cinema going has been so impossible, in theory, that's like VR's time to shine as a potential home for cinema going or for, you know, media viewing. And the fact that these apps were all kind of aping the already existent form of cinema going, seemed to reveal a kind of nostalgia, but also something inherent about like the financial model of that, and how people, even when faced with you know, the much cheaper and easier mode of home viewing, something that's obviously existed for a long time, but now in this like ever more elaborate kind of high-tech version in VR, still wanted to reclaim something of what had been lost. And I suppose now that cinemas are reopening, the draw of that will be tested economically in how these cinemas are able to bounce back, and how willing people are to, you know, go and spend cinema ticket prices again when there are such a like increasing number of quite impressive home video options available to them.
And picking up on that, I mean, one thing I've been very aware of over the last year is how remediation has worked in a very sometimes quite regressive way, and how since everything has been forced online, like you say, Charlie, you know, the same way with, you know, these VR apps which let you watch films in cinemas. Like anytime something's moved to another platform, it's aped the platform it's moved from. And so, you know, the first surge in galleries and museums, for example, was around virtual tours, like actual 3D spaces that you would move around. And some museums plowed huge amounts of money into this. The only problem being that they weren't really hugely popular and they were very clunky. And similarly with theatre, there's been this big move towards sort of live streaming empty theatre performances with, you know, a little bit of a token towards filmmaking style with the use of multi-camera and close-ups, but essentially, you know, just trying to kind of recreate the theatrical experience as best possible. And I think something quite interesting that's been emerging the last few months, you know, several months, is perhaps a slight move beyond that, and the move beyond, you know, kind of the blurring of boundaries and the creation of new forms, especially now I'm finding between like theatre and film, where you have these some quite amazing live Zoom performances that use things like real-time editing. And I sort of feel very much the spirit of what we were doing 2 years ago, you know, now being transplanted into what people are of necessity doing by having to put stuff online, basically.
Just to be the devil's advocate, isn't it that you know, we lower the whole bar, and now we need to make sense, aesthetic sense of Zoom, right? But we secretly in our heart of hearts, we know that, you know, there is a theater out there, there is a cinema, there is a monument of the aesthetic experience that we yearn for. But it's okay, you know, signs of times, let's settle for Zoom. Not this Zoom, but the aesthetic Zoom. I'm bringing that up in the light of we put such a big burden, such a big, you know, weight on the shoulders of VR to take the mantle of film, to take the mantle of theater, to take the mantle of architecture and dance at the same time in different guises and different opportunities, where to put it very bluntly, very honest, and I work in this is what I do. VR is photocopy. VR is the photocopy of your big books with your proper paintings, with your proper text. It's a photocopy. Until we start making those zines that we used to collect in university, which were photocopied, and that was the best version of them, we're gonna stay asking, hey VR, where are you? Where were you? We needed you.
I wonder if this is a good moment to ask you a question. Dolce has one ready for you.
Thank you for your thoughts. I want to start with quite a general question, because film and VR on one side seem to be tightly connected, but on the other side are incomparable. And this question is for all three of you. We would like to hear your opinions about the essential difference between VR and film.
I would say, in terms of my experience, albeit limited, of working in both, the defining difference to me has been the kind of shift away from a feeling of a fixedness to the piece of art being created. And maybe that's like especially true in the case of this VR project, because it had a live component, and, you know, it existed in various different forms over the course of its lifespan, although that does seem to be more common in general with VR. But there's, you know, in film, there's usually a pretty clear moment where the book is kind of closed, and it's going to hopefully have a life out in the world and evolve in the sense that it will be seen by lots of different eyes, and they'll respond to it in lots of different ways. And as was mentioned in the introduction, you know, it may exist on different formats and so on. But there's a kind of, as at least from the creator's perspective, there's a kind of end point that's very firm. And with this, it, you know, everything feels so much more flexible and evolving, or at least like at its best, there's really the potential for that. And so like coming out of this project and thinking about potentially working in that world again, like that's certainly what draws me to it, is the idea of ongoing flexibility and mutability, and doing away with the idea that I'm just striving to create like the best possible version of a thing and then stop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and VR itself, you know, many people would argue is just a step towards, you know, future forms of XR, you know, AR and other things. So it's part of an ongoing process. And I think we've just witnessed the third death of VR the last couple of years, but it will almost certainly be reborn again, you know, in the near future. And yeah, I mean, I would echo what Charlie says. I think the sense of, I mean, for me, the difference or the excitement of working in VR has been the sense of not knowing what the rules are. And for better or for worse, the basic filmmaking toolkit has been unchanging since the 1920s, you know, whether or not you agree with Bordwell's arguments or not, but there's a certain basis there that most films still follow. And to throw in a little bit of kind of fundamental questioning into that, I think is very healthy and exciting. And for me, I think the thing that VR most threw open was the spatial dimension. And the sense that you, in order to create I mean, we didn't perhaps do that so much in our work, but in many VR works that are out there, a narrative is spatially ascribed. So you kind of create the narrative by moving through a space. And that sense of having control over the temporality of an experience and over a narrative trajectory, which one takes for granted as a filmmaker, is suddenly gone in VR. You're much more dependent on trying to shape the movements of the user and influence them and resign yourself to whatever they may do. And that's been a kind of a liberation in a way. Though ultimately in our work, we sort of pulled back a little bit from that and actually did have something quite narratively led most of the time.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer with two angles. One is there is a tricky element that makes VR and film appear to be connected, like twins connected by one shared organ, and that is the metaphor of the camera. It appears that we take for granted that VR has a camera, and because it has a camera, it connects with film and the film language and the conventions and history. But there is no camera in VR. There is the label of a camera to be shorthand for the presence of the user's head or the user's eyes. So I would say that the main divergence that I would bring up is that there is no camera in VR. There's no need for camera. There's only the head or the eyes or the presence of a viewer, of a user, visitor has been called. That for me would be the main difference, right? And it's a tricky one. The main similarity, I think it's not so much between VR and film. It's not so much in the final product, which is to say the film, but what happens when we perform the actions that will be recorded in the film. So when we are in filmmaking, when we are on stage, on the sound stage, that is, or when we are, in plein air, we are out there when we catch life unawares, in the words of Bertolt. When we capture the action, that moment is the one that VR wants to reconstruct or construct from scratch. Not so much the end product of the film, frame after frame after frame, but the action, and try to understand the rules and the logic of that action and how people relate to the space, like Richard mentioned, how space becomes scenery, scenario at the same time, and how the characters become peers of the user and the user become a character. All those things are actoral things. They are performative things. And I think that's where film and VR meet.
Okay, thanks for the clear answers. I think you both, three of you, have a very clear view of what the differences are between VR and film. And now I would like to give the floor to Michelle, who's going to ask you the second question.
Okay, so with the next question, we want to go a bit more in depth on the machine for viewing. So my question is specifically for Charlie because it relates to his chapter of the work. The different forms of presentation of a machine for viewing, whether it's the live performance, the registration of the performance, or the lockdown version of the project, all add different layers of containers to the experience. How do you think the different forms of presentation relate to your reflection on frames and containers?
Yeah, it's interesting. That aspect, I think, only really became clear to me in hindsight, or at least in quite far into the process of making the project. I mean, I think the thing that fascinates me about, or the thing that draws me to video essay in the first place is definitely engaging with visual media in a context, like any kind of context, and placing film especially into the context of like our lives and the way that we encounter film culture. And I think it's a shame that like a huge amount of video essay work doesn't do that at all. And if anything, kind of resists that at all costs and instead examines films as these sort of, you know, immaculate objects that exist in a vacuum. And so the video essay that my episode of A Machine for Viewing was kind of adapted from, it was originally just a 2D flat video essay called Frames and Containers. And it was all about essentially the kind of tussle between the film frame, the shape of any given film, and the container, i.e. whatever you're viewing it on, whether it's a cinema screen, a TV, a tablet, anything. And so already, you know, I was kind of encouraging the viewer to engage with the fact that, you know, film exists somewhere. It exists on a screen or a surface of some kind. But still, that was sort of through implication. And I think the pleasure of placing it now into a VR space is I'm putting it on a literal screen for people and encouraging them to think about the kind of malleability of that relationship. And so within the body of my episode of A Machine for Viewing, you know, you're getting this found media, but you're getting it mediated through all kinds of different screens, whether it's a cinema screen with evolving proportions that change throughout the episode, or on, you know, a virtual phone. It's kind of forcing people to engage with this mediation. And obviously the headset itself is just this whole additional layer of mediation that even when you're watching it on a screen, you're not watching it on a screen, you're watching it on two screens that are right up in front of your face. So for me, yeah, like that only kind of enhances the ideas that to me are interesting about the piece to begin with, which is, yeah, that ongoing relationship between media and the context in which we encounter it. You know, this rectangular image of me, but encountered through, you know, a larger rectangle with two other rectangles with two other people in different corners of the earth on it. You know, you can't separate your consumption of any of it from the rest. You know, I can drop my red pencil down here and Richard will receive it from there. He's done it on the wrong side.
Oh no,
close
I
enough.
ruined it.
I get it from
Yeah,
there.
so for me, that it kind of just revealed itself further the more we went into it.
Thank you. And we'll now give the word to Justina for the third question.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My question I will direct to you, Richard. In In your part of A Machine for Viewing, you asked the question where someone would like to sit in relation to the screen. You yourself choose to sit in the front, so close you can almost touch the film. And then you show a film essay of off and on blurred shots. I scribbled this down, so I have to check my own writing. I am myself very interested in hapticity of cinema, both within films, but also of the materiality of which films are made. And even in our digital age, films are stored on hard drives, USBs, disks, and data centers. And my question to you is, how do you reflect on the hapticity of VR? Is it more material than traditional cinema because you can use your body, or maybe less so because of the use of your body, you maybe experience a lack when you experience VR?
I mean, I would say I guess like for me, the most startling moment I've ever had experiencing VR was the very, very first Oculus Rift onboarding experience that I had. It's like the 10-minute intro where it basically trains you how to manipulate objects when they're not physically there. And it was just, jaw-dropping. It's like actually sort of, manipulating a floppy disk and putting it into a 1980s computer and learning that the disk is not there and learning how to make that imaginative leap to bridge the gap. And yet when you're in VR, you never quite do it. You're always heightenedly aware of the physical space that you're in. So in answer to your question, in one way, I suppose maybe, it could be either, you can, there is a sort of a hapticity to it, a quite intoxicating one, but also a lack. But I think like what still interests me perhaps most about VR is actually the size and distance of screen question, the question of proximity. And sort of picking up where Charlie left off, talking about different screen shapes and sizes. I'm still like, VR is basically just a very, very small screen, very, very, very close to your eyes. And it's so close to your eyes that it creates the illusion that there's nothing beyond the frame. And I think that's I think what my episode of the video was about was sort of exploring what's the added value of that proximity, and does it does it matter physically, or is it just an impression? Is it just a perceptual thing? So is there any qualitative difference between sitting at the back of a cinema, looking at an image from 30 meters away on a 10-meter wide screen, or sitting in front of a laptop from 30 centimeters away, looking at an image on a 50 centimeter screen? And I'm not sure there is. I'm sure there is, but it's not self-evident. And in the same way, coming back to the question of hapticity, I feel that hapticity often, it's a very interesting topic for an academic, but I think the invocation of hapticity is often used as a kind of a snobbery, an argument for the 16mm print, for the cinema screening over the online viewing. And I am a little bit critical to the value of cinematic hapticity, I would say. And I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you. I will also read out Sarah's question, our fellow student who couldn't be here today, unfortunately. So I will direct that question to you, Oscar. You come from Chile and you studied in Australia, where you are currently staying. Thanks for being here during the night. How would you say the different perspectives you've encountered and or adopted in changing places and spaces affect your study, perception, and experimentation with VR? And similarly, to what extent did your participation in a machine for viewing, working with two other perspectives, affect your work, as it looks quite different from other works of you, such as Ascent or Easter Rising, if I read it correctly?
Sarah, thanks for your question, wherever you are. Hope you're okay. Yes, I've been here in Australia for the last 13 years, and coming from Chile, from South America, being a native speaker of Spanish and now understanding the world through the English language, you can imagine that language translation as well as physical translation from one place to another has been a thing that has marked my life, and because of marking my life, it has marked my practice as well. So the exercise of understanding and making and building the bridge between these two art forms, VR and film, it's a pretty intimate process that I engage with. So when we talk about different perspectives, I think that because of perspective being understood as a visual thing, as a visual construction, mostly, first and foremostly, there is something that doesn't get quite well captured when we talk about my trying to translate or to capture that the different reality of two different places, namely Chile and Australia, but also the mental place of film and the mental place of VR. I think lately, and probably this is reflected on the machine for viewing, that transition has been moving away from trying to capture the visual reality, which in computer art, in games, in VFX conversations, technical conversations, you can find is the quest for photorealism. That identifying that reality, it's more truthful because it has photorealistic qualities. I'm not fond of that journey, and I don't take that quest as my quest. So I've been trying to move away from that and finding what is the other thing, another side door into the capacity of VR, into the potential of VR. And I'm currently thinking that door might be time. So when you hear me complaining about the need to call this center of experience the camera, the initial metaphor to put you in this 3D space is offered as a camera, is labeled as a camera. That means that we are capturing that reality in a visual centric way. And I'm thinking that if I showed you, we're talking about my traveling from Chile to here and what that means in kind of a life dimension. I don't think that if I showed you pictures of stages or the kind of the scenery that surrounded me in those places, that would convey quite well my feelings, my emotions, my process of moving through these places. I think the changes, they call the time capsules, is a closer kind of exercise in terms of the artistic or expressive or aesthetic qualities that it has. So when I say time capsule, I'm talking in the light of narrative, right? In stories, we can recognize we are seeing a story, we are hearing a story because we can track some sort of change. We recognize a character, we see that they are facing some sort of crisis, and then they get to the resolution point, and we can see them change, and we kind of change with them. I don't think that is quite well captured when we think of spaces and visual representation. But when we try to capture their time, the changes over time in other qualities, I don't know exactly which ones. So I'm opening up a current thought process that I'm going through. Other entry points, maybe sound, maybe the voice being this kind of guiding line. I think I find better answers to what VR can be. So right, to try to put it very briefly, yes, it has affected, it had some impact this moving across cultures and time zones and geographies. But I think that to try to answer that, to try to represent that, I stopped thinking about trying to capture visual reality, either the way that film does it or the way that VR tends to do these days. And I'm thinking of all the things, you know, actions and capturing the time as the substrate. We said, I think that was mentioned earlier, the material or the hapticity. You know, how do you confirm physically that material is present in the artwork? That question is the question that I'm having with time. It's not a simple thing. That's where I'm at.
Thank you for your ongoing thoughts. I will give back the word to Giovanna now. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Richard, Charlie, and Oscar. Thank you very much for being here with us today in those nice rectangles on the screen. Next time, in person here in Amsterdam, we'll figure out a way.
You keep saying that.
Thank you to Sarah, Michelle, Dorce, and Justine. This was the last session of This is Film for 2021. A special thank you to the whole This is Film class for your enthusiastic contribution to the series. And a big thank you to my colleagues at Eye for making This is Film Online possible. I hope to see you all back next year with a new This is Film series from March to May 2022. Goodbye and take care.